Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of One Room Schoolhouse. We've been talking the last couple episodes about cancel culture, and really it started when we got this poster which highlights a Czechoslovakian town that Nazis went and literally removed the town. They killed all the men, they took all the women and children, sent them to various concentration camps, and they destroyed the town. They said, we will never speak of the town again. So kind of Orwellian that we're now changing this. It never really existed, it never was there. And in the midst of cancel culture, there have been a lot of things happening in our modern culture that we are seeing attacks on specific beliefs or values, and people are being deplatformed. They're thrown off social media, or what we've been known as canceled, right? Cancel culture is a real thing. There are some political pundits out there, there are some even leftist professors who argue that's not a real thing, except we know that people are actually being canceled. And so we've talked a little bit about kind of the big picture cancel culture, that we're not in favor of saying we should never have conversations anymore, but we are in favor of saying that we should promote what is true. For example, like the King James Bible, where King James said, I want no competition in the Bible market. We only want the King James Bible, because all the other Bibles had commentaries. Not all, but at least the Geneva Bible had commentary that was critical of the king, and so we don't want that criticism.
And by the way, that's not saying the King James Bible is bad, because the Bible itself is really good. He didn't do the Bible. He's
the translation.
That's right.
Yeah, very well translated. And this is even interesting kind of Bible history, that roughly 95% of all English translations, especially to that point, were going back to William Tyndale's translation and the work he had done, kind of laying the groundwork. So no criticism at all of the translation necessarily is what this conversation is, other than to point out that King James, who the actual Bible was named after, he wanted to remove any competition in the Bible market. So he was canceling things that he didn't like. And this is, again, it's not really a new thought for people in political positions of power, for kings, for dictators, for tyrants, to cancel people they don't like. It's not unusual for people just in general who have a powerful position to say, hey, we're not going to say that, we're not going to do this. So cancel culture is not really a brand new thing. And we talked about the fact that we're not certainly in favor of canceling conversations about things. We're not in favor of burning books, but also there's a difference between what we are going to fund, maybe from a government level, where President Biden now has said that they're going to give extra grants to schools that teach the 1619 Project, that teach critical race theory. We don't think that's a very sound idea, because those are historically inaccurate things. Those are things that are fundamentally destructive to America. In the midst of that, Jonathan, you pointed out that even in Roman history, there was something, a law, a code that...
Yeah, damnatio memoriae, where they would go in, and if you had this declared against you, basically any pictures of your family, you would be erased out of them. Any examples of your name would be, scratched out of a manuscript or an engraving. I mean, literally your name and memory would be abolished from the books.
So one of the crazy things with hearing the fact that people are erasing your total memory, that actually happened in America from a guy named Woodrow Wilson. We've talked about him before. We've talked about his history set before, where in his collection, the 5-volume set of American history, which happens in the 1900s, he removes every single black American, every hero from the Civil War, from the War of 1812, from the American Revolution. I mean, all the way back even in the era of the Pilgrims, right? Matthias de Souza, who back in 1641, he's elected in Maryland as part of their state legislature. Like amazing heroes and people of great accomplishments, but if they were a black person, he says, we will no longer remember or honor their memory. So Woodrow Wilson changes the entire dynamic of the way people learn American history.
And this is a great example of how history can affect public policy. Because if you do not teach the black heroes that we had, and this is just one indication, this is a book from before Woodrow Wilson. It goes back to 1850s. It's by William Nell, who is the first black man to hold a position in the federal government. And in this book, he has dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and even dozens of black heroes. Now,
and black heroes from like the 1700s.
That's right. They're American Revolution guys. This book is only about the American Revolution. He didn't look past the American Revolution. This is just revolution. So you take this. Well, if we knew these black heroes, I wonder if the racial tensions might be different today. I wonder if we knew, like the James Armistead said.
Right. If, for example, we knew that the reason George Washington was able to fight at Yorktown and defeat Cornwallis was because they got intelligence from a spy in a British camp who told them, hey, Cornwallis is moving, taking his men. If we go here at this time, we can capture the commander of all the British forces, Cornwallis. We might win this war. Well, that intelligence came from a black man. Lafayette is the one who writes to Washington about this information because James Armistead worked with Lafayette. Actually, James Armistead kind of became like an adopted son to Lafayette. He actually takes the last name. He was known as James Armistead Lafayette or James Lafayette. His story is amazing. It's arguable that there would not have been the same victory or maybe a victory at all had it not been for the work of black patriots in the American Revolution. And these were things that early history books used to highlight some of these black heroes. Today we know none of them, and largely goes back to Woodrow Wilson, became the standard for public school history, really the 1900s going forward. And so today people know really none of these black history and heroes.
And as far as so many young folks in school today, black young folks, for example, when they read history books, and so many of our history books today are based on this kind of history, they don't see themselves in history. They don't see the James Armisteads or the hundreds that were there. They see maybe a Martin Luther King, maybe somebody like a Booker T. Washington or Rosa Parks. And so as far as they're concerned, they've got no role in America. And so there would be racial tensions. But yet, if you go back and look at what's taken out and what we used to teach before Woodrow Wilson canceled it, it would make such a difference in race relations today and even what's happening in the culture if we knew how. There never was a time when America was not to some degree a melting pot of races and even of other nationalities. I mean, it's never been this white-only thing that is so often seen today until a white racist came in and made it white-only.
And this is where, from Woodrow Wilson's work, where he says that there are certain people that we will no longer mention their names. And obviously it's a very racist notion. Arguably, he was inspired from some of the work of Charles Darwin because that was kind of the scientific position. And as a great academic, we trust the science, which I'm a little skeptical about in general. But this notion of we're going to trust the science, and that's what, really the position of science that from Darwin was that the white people were more evolved. This is part of his Descent of Man. It's what he argues in several parts in this. And in the midst of this, Woodrow Wilson holds this, what was viewed as his academic position, that we shouldn't honor any black person in American history. Obviously, incredibly racist position, terrible. That became the standard for the way we learn about American history in general. And even that, as you mentioned, go back to the American Revolution. How many black heroes were there at the American Revolution? Well, even if you look at political differences, right? The Republican Party was birthed as the party who were saying, wait a second, we believe in equal rights for all people, regardless of skin color. And if you look at some of the major leaders in the Republican Party, especially back in Civil War era, they were black leaders.
Yeah, basically every single Republican Party in a southern state was predominantly founded by emancipated slaves who were starting the Republican parties in their state. The Republican Party of Texas started by predominantly African Americans. And you can look in the Reconstruction era, that's where you get the first, elected African Americans to the House and to the Senate, guys who participated at the highest levels of the federal government in the late 1800s, guys like Blanche Kelso Bruce, who was the first African American person to have his name on the currency. This is actually a dollar bill that has, you can see his printed signature right there. And he was actually a senator as well before this, and then he was appointed as the registrar of the Treasury. So an incredibly important and significant guy.
And by the way, can I add, he is the first black man in American history to receive a nomination for Vice President of the United States. That might be worth mentioning somewhere.
Yeah,
but
guys like
back in the 1800s.
Guys like Wilson takes Kelso Bruce and dozens, hundreds of other heroes, American heroes, out of the textbook. What's fascinating is you even see the same kind of policy of cancellation in things like the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project hardly mentions any sort of the African American heroes from the Revolution, from the Civil War, from Reconstruction, and it's a very negative view. It's kind of a cancellation of omission. It's kind of, in many ways, it's building off of the work of Woodrow Wilson, where these heroes don't get mentioned.
Right, because the heroes from the American Revolution who were African American heroes, who were black heroes, the black heroes of the War of 1812, the black heroes of the Civil War, it doesn't fit the narrative today to say that America arguably won many of those wars, many of those conflicts because of the black heroes along the way. Because if all of a sudden the heroes of the battle, the heroes of these wars are the black heroes, then black people were not merely oppressed by white people if they're the victors of these encounters. And this is where part of what you're saying is the omission of this. Well, there's different motivations behind the omissions, obviously, right? Because Woodrow Wilson is saying that right, black people are not on the same level as white people. They shouldn't be honored. Whereas the 1619 Project is saying we want to make sure everybody knows how oppressed all black people were. And now, while it's certainly true that if you go back historically, there definitely were oppressive moments, but this is the history of the world where all people at some point were oppressed, all people at some point oppressed other people. That happened in America as well, but certainly not all of America was tarnished by promoting and participating in some of this great evil of oppression, whether it be white people enslaving black people or slavery on any other level. Not everybody encouraged and participated in that. There were many people who actively fought against that in abolition movements, among multiple other things. But the point is that this is the omission that we are seeing now, is that so many heroes that should be honored, right? Go back to Woodrow Wilson, where he said there's certain people whose names should not be mentioned, right? Or based on skin color, we should never talk about them. That's an incredibly racist position. But similarly true would be if you have people that don't fit the narrative, even if they were great heroes, saying, well, we shouldn't talk about them, even though they're a great hero, because they don't fit the narrative. Well, that's a pretty terrible way to, at this point, cancel someone just because they don't fit your narrative.
Well, the other thing about fitting narratives is narratives shape public policy. And what Woodrow Wilson did shaped public policy. No question, led to revival of the Klan, etc. And this is where we would differ with 1619. 1619 wants to create a public policy that is totally different from what history has reflected. So you have to ignore the history that contradicts what they want. From us, we think we should teach all the history, the good, the bad, the ugly, and let public policy be based on truth. So whether it's Woodrow Wilson's 1619 Project, they create narratives from history to fit what they want the objective of policy to be. And that's where you really have to be careful with history, because it does become enacted into legislation based on what you view and what you think about the nation, what you think about relations. If you get that history wrong, you're going to get your public policy wrong.
Yeah, and this is where it's even interesting looking at the Bible. If you go through the kings of Israel, it tells a story of some really bad, awful kings of Israel, right? Like, why would you include that? The Bible is something that we go to for spiritual guidance, for inspiration, to learn the truth of who God is, His character and nature. But you have some really terrible kings that are there, well, because that's the truth of what happened, right? Not every king was an honorable king in Israel's history. Not every president in American history was an honorable president. Woodrow Wilson, not an honorable president when it came to a lot of his philosophical, political positions.
Probably a top 5 worst president for us, yeah.
Probably top 2.
Top 3.
Yeah,
three maybe, right? So with that being said, right, even then, we're not in favor of canceling Woodrow Wilson. We say there are important lessons we learned from these guys. The same reason we can point to Confederate statues. Some people say we should tear them down. Well, what we would say is let's just be honest about who they were and what they did. You don't need to cancel history. Just be honest and truthful. But this is one of the reasons why, again, we oppose critical race theory. We oppose the 1619 Project because they're not being honest in their presentation of history. And this is part of where, as we look big picture cancel culture, again, a lot of moments in American history where things were canceled and had major impact, as you mentioned, even legislatively, changed the nation because of a cancel movement. We are living in an era now, might fundamentally change the nation in the midst of this cancel movement. But there's a lot of lessons we can learn along the way. One of our favorite things to talk about as far as a really cool items, artifacts from American history is something that we're going to come to on the next episode of One Room Schoolhouse. So make sure you find us next time on One Room Schoolhouse.